Hey folks, this is your host, the one, the only, Thrifty Gamer 83 here. Just taking a quick look at Final Fantasy VII. My heavens, wasn't this a game in its day? It was one of the greatest games you could ever play. It was one of the greatest games you could ever own. And to be honest, it was the game which made me get a PlayStation. Yes, it was the game which made me get a PlayStation. It was that classic game. It was the greatest. Just like Resident Evil 2, I just took a look at it and I said, I have to get this. And you just don't realize how great games like this are unless you look at the context of the time. The time was the late 90s, and just my Super Nintendo was getting older, my Nintendo was getting older, my older brother had a PlayStation, we used to game on it all night long. Final Fantasy VII, Resident Evil 2, you know, the classics. And then there was the original Resident Evil, which I picked up later, and then Resident Evil 3, and I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe how great these games were. It was kind of like, why didn't anybody ever tell me these games were this great? Oh, this one used to play heck with me. You have to... You had to hit them at the same time. So, yeah, it just... When you play Final Fantasy VII, it really does take you back. It takes you back to that gritty 90s era of gaming, almost like a grunge scene of gaming, which produced a lot of classics. And it also saw a time period where the heavy hitters were walking away from Nintendo due to their ill-advised choice of a cartridge-based medium. So now you had Squaresoft leaving Nintendo, which nobody would have seen coming, which it took years to rebuild that relationship, just to bring it back. And nowadays you can find Final Fantasy VII collections actually on the Nintendo Switch. You can actually find them on the Switch now. And before, it had just been a casualty of the Sony-Nintendo conflict, separation and divide. Both companies were really, really bitter. And it showed in the games, which you could just say got away. It showed with Final Fantasy VII. It showed with Resident Evil 2 and Capcom. Nintendo had put itself so far behind. It wasn't until the Wii that they actually could say that they were producing a console that could adequately handle what third parties would throw at it. And sadly, when you play games from that era, when you play cartridge media like I play with the Nintendo 64, I love games like playing Winback on the 64. I love games like GoldenEye on the 64. I'm just checking the baby monitor. My toddler's still napping. So yeah, you could basically say that above all things, Nintendo's greatest mistake was their arrogance in the fact that they viewed the CD as an easily copied medium, when in fact it didn't hold up in their case. There weren't too many CDRWs available. They cost a pretty penny from that era. I can remember getting one for my computer, which was $80. And back then, that was money. So you bear in mind it was a few years after, and things had died down, but still, Nintendo went with, well, it can't be, the cartridge-based medium can't be easily copied, so we win. And they lost. They lost a lot of third-party developers. It took years, decades to rebuild those relationships even. And nowadays, when I look back at that era, I think Final Fantasy VII, Resident Evil 2. Two of the greatest games you can ever own to have in your library. And then I look at the smaller players, like Dino Crisis. And doing this look back just solidifies how bitter of a separation Nintendo and Sony had with each other. This wasn't just a small phenomenon. This was big. This was industry making. It made Sony a powerhouse in the industry of video games. It made Nintendo drop down. And with Sega was virtually on the doorway anyway, even with the Saturn, even with innovations that they had made. Everything was completely going downhill for Sega. It's a wonder it lasted up until the Dreamcast. And now, like I said before, looking back, games which made me get a PlayStation, of course Final Fantasy VII. Of course, the collection of games you could get. Final Fantasy Collection, I do believe, with Chrono Trigger and Final Fantasy VI on board. Yeah, it was awesome. You wanted those games in your collection. You wanted to have them back in a digital format. So now, looking at that console or the gravity of the situation, Nintendo versus Sony, it wouldn't be until later when they had Nintendo versus Sony versus Microsoft that you would see really any competition. And like I said before, a game like this, a game like Final Fantasy VII is so beautiful to play. It's so beautiful to remember it too. And when I think about it, when I honestly think about how much time had passed, about me and my older brother playing this for hours on end, I think of just all the time spent, me and him. This was a game that we played for hours on end. We could play from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m., take an hour nap, and then come back to it. Yeah. Alright, folks. Rant, rave, love, hate. Love, hate, you're keeping my show on the air. As always, have a good one. I hope to see you guys soon on this channel. Click the subscribe button. Comment if you can. Have a good one. I'm out.